the south of France, where the land folds itself into high, cold plateaus and the forests grow so thick that the sun gives up halfway down, there's a province that used to be called Gevaudan. Today, it's mostly the department of Lozère. Back in the 1760s, it was something else, something older, a place of granite and wet moss and black water, a place where the winters were long enough that people forgot what warm weather felt like, and where the trees had been standing for 1,000 years before anyone had thought to name them. The roads, if you could call them roads, were goat tracks. Travellers moved between waterholes by instinct, picking their way around marshes and through thickets that closed behind them like a door shutting. Trade barely reached the villages, news barely reached the locals. What reached the townsfolk was weather and wolves and the slow turning of the church calendar. The people who lived there were farmers and shepherds mostly. Poor, devout. The kind of Catholic faith that still held room for older things underneath it. For signs and omens, for the feeling that the woods at the edge of the pasture were watching back. And the children worked. Boys of 8, 9, 10 years old would be sent up into the high pastures alone with a flock of sheep or a small herd of cows. Girls the same. They'd be gone for hours, sometimes the whole day, with nothing but a wooden staff and a dog, if they were lucky enough to have a dog. That was just the arrangement. That was how the household ate. In the summer of 1764, something in those high pastures began to hunt them. It started quietly. A cow herd near the Mercois forest, a woman, alone with her cattle, reported being charged by what she described as a mass of russet fur. Something low and heavy and fast. She didn't die. Her bulls, sensing the thing coming, formed a ring around her and charged it off, and the creature retreated back into the trees. That was the first sign. A herd of cattle could still drive it away. That wouldn't be true for very much longer. On the 30th of June 1764, a 14-year-old girl named Jeanne Boulet was killed near the village of Les Hubacs. She was the first confirmed death. Her throat had been torn out. 6 weeks later, another girl, also 14, was found near the hamlet of Maméjean. Same wounds, same manner of killing. Neither girl received the final sacraments before burial. In a community that took such things seriously, that detail travelled. It travelled from farm to farm and village to village, and by the time it reached the market towns, it had grown teeth of its own. People began saying the killings were a punishment, a sign that whatever was in the forest wasn't entirely of the forest. The descriptions started coming in from survivors and witnesses, and they were strange. It wasn't a wolf, or it was like a wolf, but not a wolf. That was the phrase people kept using, like a wolf, yet not a wolf. It was the size of a calf. Some said a young bull, some said a donkey. Its chest was wide, broader than any wolf's chest, and its body had a pig-like heaviness to it. The coat was tawny, reddish-brown, with a dark stripe running down the spine, shoulder to tail. Its head was enormous. Its jaw was wrong somehow, too wide, too powerful. And the tail. The tail was what people kept coming back to. It was long, longer than a wolf's tail should be, supple, almost like a cat's. And it ended in a tuft. Wolves don't have tufted tails, lions do, some of the big hyenas do. The creature in Gevaudan did. It moved in enormous leaps. Survivors described it covering distances that no wolf could cover. A few claimed, and these claims were written down at the time, that they'd seen it rise up and take steps on its hind legs, and it hunted in a way that wolves don't hunt. Wolves go for the flanks, wolves hamstring, wolves bring down large prey by exhausting it by working as a pack and tearing at the legs and underside until the animal collapses. The Beast of Gévaudan went for the head. 16 of its victims were decapitated, not torn apart. Decapitated, the head cleanly removed from the body. That is a detail you do not find in the records of any ordinary wolf predation in European history. It simply doesn't happen. Wolves aren't built for it. Wolves don't do it. This thing did it again and again. It also killed beyond hunger. Bodies were found mutilated but barely eaten. Mothers found their children in pieces scattered across a pasture with no evidence that the animal had stopped to feed. And it was selective. It would walk past a flock of sheep, past cattle, past dogs, and wait for the shepherd. The human was the target. The animals were just scenery. By the end of 1764, the death toll was climbing. Young women, girls, boys, occasional adult men. But the pattern was clear, and the pattern was the people least able to defend themselves. the ones sent alone into the high pastures. And this is where it stops being a local story. France in 1764 was not in a good place. The country had just lost the 7 Years' War. The British had taken vast colonial territories. The French monarchy was wounded, embarrassed, trying to hold together a sense of its own grandeur at a moment when the rest of Europe was smirking. And then foreign newspapers started picking up the story of a village province in the south of France, where a monster was killing children, and the king's soldiers couldn't stop it. London printed it, Berlin printed it, the French monster. The beast the king's army can't kill. King Louis XV was forced to respond. Not because he cared particularly about the peasants of Gevaudan, he almost certainly didn't, but because the beast had become a symbol of French weakness, of a monarchy that couldn't protect its own people from an animal. The first man sent was Captain Jean-Baptiste Duhamel, a cavalry officer, competent, pragmatic. He arrived with a company of dragoons and treated the problem as a military campaign, which is probably the first mistake the French state made. Duhamel organised hunts on a scale the province had never seen. At the peak, he had 20,000 local peasants acting as beaters, sweeping across the Margeride in massive lines, trying to drive the beast into an ambush. He set bait. He set traps. At one point, desperate and apparently out of ideas, he dressed several of his own male soldiers in women's clothing and sent them out into the pastures, hoping the creature's preference for female victims would lure it into range. It didn't. The beast evaded every hunt. The dragoons were loud. They had horses and steel and a lot of equipment, and the terrain of the Margeride swallowed them. They'd crash through a forest in heavy columns and find nothing but silence. And then, a few days later, another body would turn up in a valley they'd already searched. Duhamel was recalled in disgrace. The king sent the Denevals next, a father and son, professional wolf hunters from Normandy, the most celebrated of their kind in France. They brought bloodhounds. They worked quietly in small groups, following tracks. They knew wolves the way a priest knows scripture. And they killed wolves, scores of them. The Margeride, as it happened, had a genuine wolf problem quite separate from the beast, and the Denevals thinned that population considerably. But the killings didn't stop. The beast was not among the wolves they shot, or if it was, they'd failed to recognize it. After months of frustration, they too were sent home. By the middle of 1765, the king was running out of professionals, so he sent his own. Francois Antoine was the royal arquebus bearer, the king's personal gun bearer, a man of the court, entrusted with the king's own firearms. He arrived in June of that year with an elite hunting retinue, royal hounds, and the full weight of the crown's authority behind him. On the 20th of September, 1765, near the Abbey of Chazes, Antoine's party cornered an unusually large wolf. It measured 80 centimeters at the shoulder and weighed 60 kilograms, substantially bigger than any wolf they'd taken before. Antoine shot it through the eye. The animal went down, then rose again in a final charge and was killed. The carcass was preserved. It was stuffed, mounted, and transported all the way to Versailles, where Francois Antoine presented it to Louis XV as the Beast of Gévaudan. The court was delighted. Antoine was celebrated as a national hero, given a pension, given titles. The gazettes ran triumphant accounts of the king's marksmen slaying the monster of the south. The crisis, as far as Versailles was concerned, was over, or so they thought. In late December of 1765, barely 3 months after the Wolf of Chazes had been laid at the king's feet, the killings resumed. And this is where the story turns. Because the crown had already declared the beast dead, the king had already been photographed, metaphorically speaking, with the corpse. Going back on that, admitting that the Wolf of Chazes was not the creature, or not the only creature, would have been a political humiliation on top of a political humiliation. So Versailles did something very deliberate. It went quiet. The gazettes, under royal pressure, stopped reporting on Gevaudan. The official line was that the beast was dead. Any further killings were local wolf attacks, unfortunate, rural problems, nothing for the crown to concern itself with. The province was abandoned. For the next 18 months, the people of Gevaudan lived through what might have been the worst of it. The beast, or the beasts, went back to work. The death toll kept climbing. Children kept disappearing from the high pastures, and their parents kept finding what was left of them. And the state, officially, was no longer listening. Into that vacuum stepped the local nobility and the church. The Marquis d'Apcher, a young nobleman whose own lands were bleeding, started organising hunts out of his own pocket. These weren't royal productions, these were local men with local knowledge, farmers, innkeepers, hunters who'd been walking these forests their whole lives. And the Bishop of Mende had already much earlier in the crisis reframed the whole affair. On the 31st of December 1764, Gabriel Florent de Choiseul-Beaupré, the Count Bishop of Mende, had issued a pastoral letter to the province. The beast, he wrote, was a divine plague, a punishment from God for the people's insufficient devotion, a warning of damnation. The creature in the forest wasn't an animal problem, it was a spiritual one. That letter changed everything at ground level. The hunts that followed had prayers attached to them. Rosaries were carried, medals of the Virgin Mary were blessed and worn. The peasants, convinced that bullets alone wouldn't be enough, began to believe that what they were facing needed to be killed with something holy. And that brings us to Jean Chastel. Chastel was a local man, an innkeeper, a hunter, not a noble, not a soldier, a countryman who knew the march rite the way a person knows the shape of their own house in the dark. He was a man of deep faith, in the way that faith was practiced in 18th century rural France, which is to say it was woven into everything. The saints were real people, the Virgin was a neighbour, the devil walked sometimes. On the 19th of June 1767, almost exactly 3 years after the death of Jean Boulet, Chastel joined a hunt organised by the Marquis d'Apcher at a place called the Sogne d'Auvers. What happened next is half history and half legend, and the two halves have been arguing ever since. The history is this. During the hunt, a large canid came into Chastel's line of fire. He shot it. It went down. The killings in Gevaudan stopped immediately afterwards and never resumed. The legend, however, is this. Chastel, the night before the hunt, had melted down a silver medal of the Virgin Mary and cast it into bullets. He'd taken those bullets to a priest and had them blessed. He carried them loaded in his musket, and when the beast stepped out of the brush in front of him, he was reading from his prayer book. He finished the verse, closed the book, stood up, raised the gun, and fired a silver bullet blessed by a priest into the heart of the creature. Now, per the historical record, the silver bullet story is almost certainly a later addition. The contemporary reports of the killing, including the official autopsy, do not mention silver. The silver bullet as a werewolf killing motif was largely codified much later, partly by 19th century folktales retelling the Gevaudan affair, and decisively by the Universal Studios film The Wolfman in 1941. But the story, once it was told that way, stuck. And it stuck because it felt true. Because by 1767, the peasants of Gevaudan had already been treating the beast as a spiritual enemy for 2.5 years, and the idea that a blessed bullet had finished it made narrative sense in a way that made the killing bearable. The body was brought to the Chateau de Besque, and this is where it gets strange. The royal notary, a man named Roch Etienne Marin, was called in to examine the carcass and produce an official report. The Marin autopsy survives. It's one of the most important documents in the whole affair because it gives us a contemporary, sober, non-superstitious look at what Chastel had killed. The animal was enormous. The head was oversized, disproportionate. The jaw was described as monstrous, wider and more powerful than any wolf's. The teeth were unusual. The coat matched the descriptions witnesses had been giving for 3 years. The reddish colour, the dark dorsal stripe, and inside the stomach, Marin found the femoral head of a young child. That's the detail that settles something. Whatever else this creature was, it had killed and eaten a human being recently enough that the bone was still in its gut. This was the right animal, or an animal very like the right one. The carcass was preserved and sent, as the Wolf of Chazes had been, toward the royal court. But this time the court didn't want it. Versailles had already closed the file, had already given Antoine his pension, had already declared the beast dead in 1765. Accepting Chastel's kill meant accepting that the crown had been wrong, that the peasants had been right, that an innkeeper from the Margeride had succeeded where the king's own gun-bearer had failed. The remains were not properly preserved. They rotted on the journey. By the time the body reached Paris, it was, per the accounts of the time, unfit for examination and was disposed of. There is no skeleton, there is no pelt, there is no skull. 3 years of killing, roughly 100 confirmed dead, with some longer-term studies putting the total, including the injured and the partly eaten, closer to 500. and the physical evidence of what did it was thrown away because it was politically inconvenient. Which is why we still, in the year 2026, don't know what the Beast of Gévaudan actually was. There are theories, serious ones. The most widely accepted modern hypothesis is a wolf-dog hybrid. Large livestock guardian dogs and mastiffs were common in the Massif Central in the 1700s, and the occasional interbreeding with wild wolves would have produced an animal with the hunting instinct of a wolf and the size and fearlessness of a domestic dog raised around humans. The coat patterns fit, the body shape fits, the boldness toward people fits. It doesn't quite explain the decapitations. The second serious hypothesis is a striped hyena. The striped hyena has a mane that stands erect along the spine. That's the dorsal stripe the witnesses kept describing. It has jaws capable of crushing bone, which matches the injuries. It has a recognizable laughing vocalization, and several Gevaudan witnesses described the beast making a sound like laughter. There are even early 19th century museum records in Paris reportedly cataloguing a Beast of Gévaudan specimen as a brown hyena, though the evidence is thin and contested. The problem with the hyena theory is climate. Hyenas are tropical and subtropical animals. Surviving 3 consecutive winters in the Margeride, which gets properly harshly cold, would be a serious challenge. The third, more exotic theory is a young male lion, possibly escaped from or released by a nobleman's private menagerie. Menageries were a status symbol for the French aristocracy. Animals did sometimes escape. A juvenile lion would have a tufted tail, which wolves don't, and would hunt by ambush and pinning, which matches the accounts from survivors who said the beast had leapt onto them and held them down with its forepaws. And then there's the fourth theory, which is the dark one. The fourth theory is that the beast had a human behind it. Some researchers have pointed at Jean Chastel himself or at his sons, who were reportedly volatile men with a reputation for knowing how to handle animals. The theory suggests that the creature was a deliberately bred and trained wolf-dog hybrid, raised as a weapon, and that it had been fitted with an armoured covering, a cuirass of boar hide dried hard, bristled with coarse hair. Boar hide in that condition would explain the black dorsal stripe, the strange appearance, and, crucially, the repeated reports that the beast was resistant to musket fire. Low-velocity lead balls would have glanced off cured boar skin at a distance. The killings would have stopped when Chastel decided to stop them, and Chastel, being the one who killed the final animal, would have had the perfect cover. There's no trial record, there's no confession, there's no proof. But the theory has been taken seriously enough by enough historians that it hasn't gone away. What we're left with is an absence. The beast was killed, or one of the beasts was killed, in June of 1767. The attacks ended, the province went back to being what it had always been, remote, cold, poor, quiet. The Marquis d'Apcher faded from the story. Jean Chastel went back to his inn. The Bishop of Mende moved on to other pastoral concerns. There was one other figure worth remembering before this story closes. Her name was Marie-Jeanne Vallée. On the 11th of August, 1765, right in the middle of the crisis, she was walking with her sister near the River Dege when the beast came at them. Vallée didn't run. She had a staff with a bayonet fixed to the end of it, the kind of improvised weapon poor country people had taken to carrying, and when the creature came within range, she drove the bayonet into its chest. The beast broke off the attack. It retreated into the water and then into the forest, wounded but alive. She became known, locally and then nationally, as the Maid of Gévaudan, the Amazon. A peasant girl who had done what Duhamel's 20,000 men and the Denneval's bloodhounds and the king's own gun-bearer had all failed to do. She'd made the beast bleed. There's a statue of her now near where it happened. She's holding the bayonet. The beast is at her feet. The Beast of Gévaudan killed for 3 years. It killed roughly 100 people that we can confirm, and perhaps many more that we can't. It humiliated a king, exhausted an army, outwitted professional hunters, and was eventually brought down by a countryman with a musket. Possibly a silver-loaded one, possibly not. Its remains were lost. Its species was never determined. Its final autopsy sits in an archive in France, describing an animal that shouldn't quite have existed, and the forests of the Margeride are still there. The Aubrac Plateau is still there. The ponds and the granite and the 1,000-year-old trees are still there, though fewer of them now. And the high pastures where the children used to take the flocks are still there too. Was it a wolf dog bred too big and too bold? A hyena somewhere it had no business being? A lion loose from a nobleman's menagerie? A dog in armour, with a man on the other end of a long, careful plan? Or was it, as the Bishop of Mendes said from the beginning, something else entirely? A punishment walking on four legs through a cold forest, waiting for the sound of a shepherd's voice on a summer afternoon? The king decided, the church decided, the gazettes decided. The Marguerite, however, never really felt full closure.